Welcome to the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast, the bi-weekly show that brings you the best of powerlifting in Canada. Our three co-hosts include Ryan Stinn, holder of the heaviest equipped squat and total in Canada, as well as owner of Unparalleled Training Center and co-owner of Inner Strength Products. Steve Cassioli, IPF world record holder and medalist, the third strongest classic lifter in Canadian history, and owner of Cassioli Strength and Conditioning. Lastly, Avi Silverberg, world team coach and world bench press medalist, owner of PursuitOfStrength.com, a site dedicated to coaching and education for powerlifters. Today's episode starts right now.
Season 2 of the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast is brought to you by LVD Fitness. LVD Fitness is a powerlifting apparel brand that donates 1 month of clean water to a child in need for every item sold. Follow them on Instagram and Facebook at LVD Fitness to join the movement.
Hello and welcome to the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast Season 2. We got a fantastic episode for you. We have Marc Morris, who is joining us again on the podcast. He was on the podcast earlier in Season 1 when we were at the Commonwealth Powerlifting Championships. He was one of the coaches on the team, and we talked about some of the athlete management issues and some of the intricacies of what goes on behind the scenes in coaching at a large-scale event like that. And now he's joining us on the podcast to talk about nutrition. He has a PhD in nutritional sciences. He just graduated, and he works with a number of athletes in that regard. And he has some fantastic information on not only long-term nutritional planning in terms of what you need to be doing, 3 to 4 months out from a meet, but also that meet week, that short-term making the weight class sort of thing. So fantastic episode, and he has a fantastic giveaway. If you listen to the end, we'll be making that announcement then too. But I got a fantastic podcasting announcement here, guys. Fantastic podcasting announcement. And that is, everybody, Ryan Stindler. He got Snapchat, everybody. Y'all going to have to add Ryan to Snapchat. Ryan, how does it feel now to be a Snapchatter?
I don't know. Confusing.
It's confusing at first. Give it a couple weeks. I'm coaching Ryan along in the process here. He's going to have fantastic Snap stories. And what's your name on Snapchat, Ryan? Is it just Stindler?
It's just Stindler, yep.
Stinn, Stinnndler. And Steve, you're still Snapchatting up a storm?
Yeah, here and there,
We're going to roll into, because we got some fantastic topics here to talk about in our Coast to Coast bi-weekly powerlifting wrap-up. This week on the Coast to Coast wrap-up, we got a few topics that we're going to talk about, but before we get into those topics, Din, you were at the Toronto Pro Show. Now, the Toronto Pro Show has been going on for a few years now, and they want to call it essentially like the Arnold North, right? They want to make it kind of like an expo like the Arnold, and they've run a powerlifting meet at that event for the last few years. It's always kind of a little bit of bad timing because, it's around Worlds. It's, you don't have kind of our top-level athletes going. It's around some provincials, like our Alberta provincials is next weekend. So, a lot of our athletes in Alberta aren't going. But can you talk a little bit about just the experience of being there, the meet, the event a little bit? And also maybe answer the question, should we be competing at the Toronto Pro Show if we see it on the schedule? Should we be planning to go to it?
Sure, yeah. Well, first off, I'll just preface this by saying that in 2009 I went to the Arnold, so I saw the event that it's kind of trying to kind of mirror itself on. So in comparison to the Arnold, it's not quite as big. I was surprised how big it was in terms of like the expo and stuff like that. The expo was quite large. There was a big CrossFit competition going on. There's a weightlift competition going on. There's strongman stuff. So there's also a couple of rings. I don't know if there's boxing or MMA going on. So lots of different sports happening throughout the expo, and pretty much every major supplement company was there, set up and handing out samples and stuff. So as far as like, should you go see it? Yeah, I think if especially if you're in the area, definitely worth going if you're a strength sport athlete or fan, right? The powerlifting event itself, like you said, a little smaller because not our major athletes are there, but still some really good competition. It was a 2-day event. They had bench only, a deadlift only, and then they had 2 sessions of 3 lift. It took 2 days. They did quite a bit of lifting on Saturday, a little less on Sunday. Sunday, I think, wrapped up around 2:30 or 3 o'clock. So, but lifting was, really good. Some great lifters, Garrett Bentley, Taylor Shadgat, and Michael Prevezda were all lifting there. They're all great athletes.
Yeah, a lot of those names are like former international team members.
Yeah, absolutely. These are not low-level athletes by any means, right? So they all lifted really well. I was set up there with SBD Canada and Inner Strength Products.
And if you were following Ryan, if you were following Ryan on Snapchat, you would know that he was displaying the new SBD belt. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, we had 2 samples of the SBD belt. That's not quite for sale yet. It'll be on sale later this month. And really tons of interest in it. I think it's a really cool design, really cool belt. Basically, it takes the benefits of a lever belt and the benefits of a prong belt and combines them. So
cool.
It's basically the only belt you really need. Although they haven't announced a price yet, but I'm guessing it's going to be up there.
The Toronto Pro Show is definitely, I like the idea of it because it really puts powerlifting on a pedestal for not just powerlifters to see, but it also, you get that broad exposure to other sports, so other sports get to see what powerlifting is all about. You get the general public, just the person who wants to go check out some, get some free supplements, they get to see, what the event's about. So definitely really cool if you like lifting in front of an audience and you want to kind of, it's more of a showy atmosphere for sure.
Yeah, there was big crowds. On Sunday, the expo felt a little slower, but I'd still say the whole time the powerlifting was going on, we had the whole area was crowded, people standing in the aisles watching. Yeah, really good exposure for the sport for sure.
So as we prep for Worlds, there's lots of athletes who are posting stuff out on social media, and one of them is your athlete. One of them is your athlete there, Steve. Now, I'm going to butcher her last name, and I always do, but Nicola Pavagalenti. Is that how you say that?
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, so she's been doing this kind of, if you've been following her on social media, you should go check her out. On Instagram, it's her handle is Stories Not Selfies. And she's kind of been doing a little bit of a road trip around Canada, really. She started in Ontario, and she came to Alberta, and she trained with our club here in Calgary for a bit, and then she was out training with your club, Steve, this past week. So it's really interesting because you coach her remotely. You coach her online. You've been programming for her for, I think she said, almost about a year now. And she's going down to Worlds as our 52 kilo junior. Absolutely insanely strong, just raw lifter. She's has this raw strength about her. And one of the things that when she was in Calgary that we talked about was just that, she is learning more about technique. And it kind of got me thinking about, with powerlifters you can be strong without technique, and then that technique can develop over time, which is different than some other sports. But so she's starting to get now a little bit more put more focus on the technique, and it kind of got me thinking around how us kind of online coaches facilitate that process in terms of ensuring that athletes are continuing to see technical development, because it's hard. You're not with them in person. I know Ryan does a lot of coaching in person, and you're not able to provide those in the moment cues or those in the moment feedback. So just maybe talk about that kind of process of how you facilitate that technical development with you being online. How does that work? How do you get her to improving on her technique?
So that this process is very, very tricky, very, very tricky process, right? So, it all comes down to, cueing. Well, first off, there's very, small things. If, when you're, bigger picture things. If, say, if you're watching someone squat, you see, a massive, knee cave in, and that's some pretty obvious things that you can, you could tell them, okay, make sure you keep your knees out, but, delivering that and for them to actually perform it, it's 2 different things, right? So, you can bombard clients with cues. Keep your knees out, chest up, back flat, heels on the ground. I don't know, all the stuff, right? Chin in. If you're gonna be giving clients 5, 6, 7 cues all at once, you can't process all that and actually do it all at once, right? So with Nicola, for example, you just gotta, we've been doing, picking at a few things, right? So some good cues for her, like say for example for squats, keep that belly button in, core tight, and that seems to help hips, shoulders, everything come up at the same time, right? Whereas some other athletes, if you're like some people might bombard them with cues, and it's just too much to process, and then their form gets even more like wackier, right? So it's a very tough topic, but a few major points are limiting the cues, and I mean keeping it to like one or two very, very simple things, and at the same time one cue that may work for someone may not work for someone else, right? Because say you tell someone to keep their chest up and they start hyperextending and opening up their core, and you don't want that either, right? So it's very, very tough topic, but I would say minimize the cues, make sure they understand the cues and how you're delivering it makes sense to them, and third is really trial and error, right?
Yeah, I think the athlete also has to be open to accepting those cues. Like
Exactly.
if you're, once the athlete starts to realize, man, I can only get so far by brute strength, by being this brute kind of strength and not focusing on technique. Like once they realize, oh man, maybe I should be, listening to some of the cues that Steve's giving me or whatever. I think then they're more willing to kind of be more coachable in that regard. And then just like you said, focusing on the bigger picture stuff. Like what's your biggest bang for your buck? And then not worrying about like the little small details, because they're probably not going to get that anyways until like they've focused on taking care of those bigger ticket items.
Exactly.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I just want to I think one thing about coaching in person versus long term is, or by distance, is that by distance you take a much longer focus. In person, I can correct this on this set. Next set, I'll correct this, right? And by distance, I watch videos every day, so one day I can correct this, and then I'll watch the next day and say, okay, it's corrected. We can focus on this now. So each correction might take, up to a week to see it implemented properly, right? Whereas in person, you can implement it, on one set, and then okay, how's that feel? Good. Let's work on this now. So you can make changes a little more rapidly, although you still want to reduce the number of changes at a time. You can't focus on that much, otherwise you spend all your time thinking and not lifting. So I think as a coach, you need to try and take a longer approach. It's going to take
which is not
longer
necessarily a bad thing.
No, absolutely not.
It's not a bad thing that you're changing technique on a weekly basis versus a daily basis, because then they just get that extra time with the technical development. They get the extra time like focusing on that one specific cue and just ingraining the motor pattern. Ryan, I want to switch topics here for a second because there's something annoying that's been happening lately, and I want to get your take on it because you've been around the game quite a long time and you work with a lot of athletes yourself and you do a lot of goal setting with your athletes. And one of the things that really frustrates me, I read something on the internet the other day, and it was a guy who, it was a bio section of a guy, and he was talking about all of, he was an online coach himself, but he was talking about all of these things that he's accomplished in his bio, and I should caveat this with saying that he's never competed in powerlifting. But anyways, I was reading on his bio that he says he wants to win an IPF World Championships. His next goal is to win an IPF World Championships, and he's never even competed in powerlifting. And without kind of getting emotional about like, well, that's just ridiculous and that's just nonsense, like screw this guy, it made me just become a little more reflective about the process of goal setting and how somebody should be structuring their goals. And do we want to be thinking about these long-term lofty goals, or do we want to be thinking about more short-term manageable kind of bite-sized goals along the way? And is there kind of a balance between the two? Like, should we have this long-term vision in mind, or should we be focusing on just right what's in front of us and what we can tackle this day or this week or this month? Like, how does the two long-term and short-term goals fit together if they do? And should we be putting more priority on one or the other?
I'll usually let my athletes set their own goals, but once they've told me their goals, I will try to assess them. If you've done your first meet and you suddenly feel like you can take on the world and you're going to squat a 50 kilo PR your next meet, well, I'm going to try and reel you back a little bit. I want you to set a goal that's both difficult but attainable, right? So in the short term, I think, Matt Gary talks often about the goal is 2.5 kilos, right? Every meet, if you can do 2.5 kilos in each of your lifts, on the long term, you're making progress, right? And I don't, not, for a new lifter, it's not necessarily the case. You can definitely look at bigger goals than that, but setting a goal, and it depends how you take missing goals too, right? If you miss your goal of 200 kilo squat in your next meet, and you take it really crappy and it really weighs on you, then you should really be careful about setting really lofty goals. You're better off to undershoot your goals and then overshoot them at the meet. But I do think having long-term goals is important, right? Having some sort of long-term vision and where you want to see yourself in 2, 3, 5 years is good. It gives you that something to always work towards. And, especially lots of people measure the sport in 12 or 16 week cycles, right? That's your next cycle towards before you go to next meet. But having that 3-year goal in mind and maybe always adjusting it after each meet is important. I think setting your next goal as winning an IPF Worlds might be a little lofty. You might want to set your next goal as to compete for the first time. But having that as a long-term goal, one day I want to win an IPF Worlds is not a bad thing. It may not be realistic for every person. I've pretty much accepted that I'm not going to win an IPF Worlds. Maybe when I get to a master I will. But in the open category, probably not. I have a goal of maybe one day getting a medal at a Worlds. So if I achieve that, then maybe I can upgrade that goal a little higher. But I think being realistic with yourself is really important. But if you're the kind of person that needs an extreme goal to push yourself, then I'll for it, right? Everyone's different.
I think I take a slightly different perspective than you. I think that I would rather prioritize these shorter term goals, and that's not to say that you don't have the bigger picture in mind. And you're saying have a bigger picture in mind. I think I'm saying the same thing too, but it's almost like the concept of somebody says I want to be a millionaire, and they like the idea of that in their mind and in their heart. It makes them feel good on the inside that they have this goal, but they don't do anything with it. They don't do anything with it because there's no, let's say, taking this example, it's like, okay, you make $40,000 a year and you're saying you want to be a millionaire. Well, why don't we try to set some goals around just getting to $100,000 a year first, not even thinking about $1 million a year. Or just like the example that I said, you want to win an IPF Worlds, but you haven't done a single competition. Why don't we make even that long-term goal of let's do a first competition? That can be a long-term goal, because it might be a year away or a year and a half away. So it's like, let's just get to that next step that inches you towards whatever the bigger picture is, but don't put the priority on the bigger picture, because all that really does is make you feel warm on the inside with not having any sort of process to follow. Makes you feel good having these lofty goals. I think
you definitely have to have the short-term goals in place to get to that long-term goal. You have to look at someone like Kelly Branton, who just recently squatted 800 pounds for 5 reps, right? That's been a long-term goal for his, right? He said he's wanted to do that since he saw a video of Bill Kazmaier doing that, right? Bill Kazmaier? Is that right?
No, either Kirk Kowalski.
Yeah, it was.
So that's a long-term goal for him. It hasn't stopped him from training up to that point. It hasn't been his only goal, but it has been a long-term goal for him. So I think having that destination in mind is always good, but you need to have, you can't say, I'm going to get in my car today and drive to California. I'm just going to go from here to California. Well, no, I have to go through all these places first, right? It's a journey, and you need to be able to set
short-term goals and like a long-term goal. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up the Coast to Coast biweekly
wrap up.
We're going to wrap up the wrap up, and
it's all wrapped up.
It's wrapped up now.
Hey, without further ado, here's our conversation with Marc Morris.
This week on the podcast, we have the one and only Marc Morris. Marc, welcome to the podcast, buddy.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
So for those of you who don't know Marc, he's been around powerlifting for quite a bit. If you haven't listened to episode 6 on the podcast, he actually joined us when we were sitting down at the Commonwealth Powerlifting Championships, and he was one of the coaches on that team. And we talked a little bit about some of the stresses and some of the athlete management issues that happen in dealing with a team of that size. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you can go back and and check out episode 6. But now we have Marc on the podcast again, and we want to talk about nutrition today. So, Marc, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Perhaps you could start with your educational background. You can talk about your powerlifting background as well, but then talk about your educational background in terms of nutrition, because it's quite impressive. I think a lot of people out there, coach others on nutrition or call themselves a nutritionist, so to speak, but really, there's some designations that you have that really kind of set you above the rest. So can you please talk about yourself a little bit?
Okay, sure. I think my story starts off similarly than with a lot of people, as I was probably a 16-year-old kid that was no longer playing high school sports and wanted to lift weights, ended up lifting weights, liked doing that more so than playing sports, and kind of got into it that way. And then from that point, I did my undergraduates in, it was like almost synthetic chemistry. It was a chemistry degree, and I realized very quickly within 2 years that I didn't want to be a chemist. Everyone in my class was really enjoying it, and I'm thinking here, I don't want to synthesize molecules for the rest of my life in a lab. So I quickly I stayed with chemistry, and I wouldn't say got through the degree, but I took the applicable stuff I needed to, and I think it was in my second year where I did my undergrad at Laurier, and I went to, Western was putting on this talk with John Berardi, and I had been following his stuff on T-Nation for probably like 2 or 3 years at this point. Probably had read everything, so I was super pumped about the opportunity to talk. And it's one of those things, I heard him talk, I saw what he was doing, I saw the letters PhD, CS next to his name, and thought, I need to go get that to make a career out of this. So that was that was essentially the start of the story. That's basically how things started. So I went to, after my undergrad, I saw an opportunity to do some research in nutrition. I came to the University of Saskatchewan, where I've been studying nutrition and chronic disease. And there's quite a bit of overlap. In grad school, you kind of learn a little bit more about the scientific process and how to read research and how to apply it. So I just finished that in December, but so that's kind of my academic background.
So this was a PhD that you just graduated with in nutritional sciences?
Yeah, you bet. I actually just convocated on Thursday. If anyone follows me on Instagram, you would see that I got a picture with Mike Babcock at my convocation, which is pretty cool. I think I was the only one that got a selfie with him. I grabbed him right when he was trying to get out of there, trying to run out, which is kind of cool, because as a coach, convocating with another coach, like probably one of the most winningest Canadian coaches of all time. That was a super cool memory. But yeah, so I just graduated on Thursday. I hadn't done it since September, but over the last 2 to 3 years, outside of being academic, I really pride myself on being a practitioner. So I've been working with people, a lot of powerlifters and normal folk, around their nutrition, mostly with body composition changes. So I think
that's a good segue into like what you actually do for a living, because I know that so one of my good friends and now business partner with my strength book, Mike McDonald, he was actually telling me yesterday that he started working with you for some nutritional stuff. So
absolutely,
you work with powerlifters, you work with, you just said, kind of general folk as well. But can you tell us what you actually do day to day? You're essentially a coach, a nutritional coach, and
yeah, absolutely. So more or less the majority of my business focuses on helping people change their body composition through nutrition. So I am a nutrition coach, just like most of you are powerlifting coaches. I do a little bit of that as well, but generally I work with people online. It takes away the barriers of having to see them in person and allows me to scale up the process. But yeah, on a weekly basis, I'm working with close to 70, 80 people, tailoring their nutrition around their goals to influence their body composition is more or less the main focus of my work. And we address food quality and those type of things, but generally helping people focus on the context of their daily nutrition definitely helps them move towards their body composition goals, which are generally 90% of the time that's what people are looking to change anyway, and health markers definitely improve because of that. But focusing on that sometimes allows them to get where they want to be. So that's what I help them with.
So I know that from some of my athletes, like I've referred a lot of my athletes to you, and they've seen some great success. But one of the most common questions that we get, I think, and Ryan and Steve would agree, is that somebody who wants to cut weight and get into a new weight class. I don't necessarily mean for like competition purposes. I mean thinking a little bit more long term. Like somebody comes to you, they say, okay, in 3 months from now, I want to be in this lower weight class, right? And obviously the goal with that process is, well, you want to retain as much strength as possible. And I think nutrition comes into play when you're looking at those goals. Like you want to cut into the new weight class, you want to get into the lower body weight, but you don't want to do it in such a way nutritionally where you're losing all sorts of strength. So do you have any kind of strategy? I guess my first question for you is, do you have any sort of strategies in terms of doing that, achieving that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing, and I think people, they kind of missed the boat on, and I kind of think of the process almost like in 2 steps. There's a process over here where it's a long phase process, and we use focusing on calorie control and the macronutrients like intake of a diet to actually influence body composition and get someone leaner while trying to maximize still or minimizing their strength losses, because when you lose weight, this is going to be a natural thing that you can't retain everything at a certain point. I mean, you do a really good job. I think generally, just anecdotally, with the amount of people that I work with, around 10% of until you get to around 10% of your body weight loss, you do a pretty good job of retaining most of your strength. At that 10% spot, things get a little wonky, and that may or may just be the focus of dieting for that long, right? So there's two real phases. It's long-term stuff where we focus on the large components of your food, macronutrients, and calorie control, because we're really, when you're trying to get into a new weight class, you're trying to and change your body composition. In most of the cases, if we're going downwards, we're looking at decreasing body fat. You're trying to change physical tissue on your body, and in order to actually change physical tissue on your body, you have to either be in a caloric surplus or a deficit. There's no getting around that. It's probably like the least sexy thing we can talk about is calories, but at the end of the day, you need to actually either create a deficit or a surplus to change those actual stores and change the tissue on your body. So in the big picture, long-term things, something that happens over weeks and months, focusing on that, moving towards a body composition goal, and then a short-term process where you're more or less focusing. It's almost the opposite. It's this allows you to get down to the weight class. Short-term stuff allows you to make a weight class where you're manipulating things like sodium intake, water intake, the actual amount of food you're eating. And this is something that it's almost the complete opposite, because in this phase, the bigger picture phase, the longer term phase, you don't need to focus on sodium intake or water intake as much, because it's more of a long-term trend towards where you're going. So those are more or less I think the 2 big phases that people don't think of. They think, oh, I can cut weight. Maybe I'm 5 kilos away. I'm going to cut it the week of a competition. And you can do that, but you can also make things easier on yourself by being as lean as you can while maximizing your strength. And I think that's what I really try to help people out with.
So going off that point of like the water manipulation, like what do you think of like a good percentages of like your weight to cut? Because a lot of people, like you see a lot of people doing like on the higher weight classes, potentially up to even 5-10 kilos of their body weight, right?
Yeah,
compared to even some like smaller lifters even doing probably around 10% range, which is pretty crazy, right?
Yeah, for sure. So if you think of like the JP Couchies doing 6 kilos on 66, like that's upwards of 72 kilos at a top end weight, right? So I generally think the safest bet for most people is doing a sodium. It's hard to say. I doubt most of those cases when they're doing upwards of 10%, they're doing just a water cut, right? They're also bringing down their baseline carbohydrate intake, which is going to help you further eliminate some water, avoiding sodium and dropping some water that way. So it's not more or less just the presence of extra water loading, then bringing it back. It's a bunch of different things, let alone also making sure that there's no food in their gut. They haven't ate probably in at least 14 to 16 hours. Mm-hmm. So that's the really, really drastic top end of things. Mm-hmm. And that's generally, in most cases, people can avoid that just by being leaner a week before a competition, right? But
so you're saying focusing on the longer term. So you said that there's 2 kind of phases. The more longer term, like the actual tissue changes, and then the short term, which is like manipulating the the sodium and the water and some of the things like that. And so you're saying like be a little bit more thoughtful around planning that long-term phase, so that when you actually get to a week out, there's not so much of that short-term stuff that you're dealing with.
Yep, absolutely, for sure, and that's completely it. And I think at the same time, we're dealing with people. Us for sure are dealing with people in 2-hour weigh-ins, and I think we've all heard the crazy drastic stories of 24-hour weigh-ins or MMA fights where they can get on an IV bag after, right? People have this idea that they're going to be able to cut 10 kilos in 2 days, and it's just not realistic in our 2-hour weigh-in setting. It's just not going to happen. You literally need to perform, in some cases, start warming up an hour and a half after. In some cases less, right, than when you weigh in, depending on what your lot number is, right? So it's not one of those things where the least drastic you have to be, the better.
So these with the big drastic cuts there, do you think so making a big 5, 6, 7 kilo cut a week prior, do you think it's possible for these people to actually get all those nutrients back in for that 2-hour weigh-in? Because a lot of people are like, oh, I got my weight back up. Do you think they actually get that quality, or are they just getting their weight back up with water, the nutrients? You think, what do you think about that there?
I think at 5 to 6 kilos cut, you're gonna have to bring your carbohydrate intake down to a point where you're basically eating no carb for 2 to 3 days leading up to it, and that's on the drastic end. So in terms of replenishing your baseline glycogen levels, that's not going to happen in a 2 to 3 hour window. So if you just focus on sodium intake as opposed to cutting your carbs entirely, I do think you'd be much better off. I think we think of powerlifting as purely in fast anaerobic sport with those energy systems, but a powerlifting meet is a long day where you're doing 4 to 5 hours between the weigh-in process. If you have good handlers, you're not touching weights outside of loading weights, or you're not going to load weights. But at the same time, it's a long process. You're taking warm-up sets where you're doing 4 reps and stuff. It's not you do tap into some glycogen reserves. So it's something where if you can avoid completely depleting yourself beforehand, I think you're in a much better spot getting through a powerlifting meet successfully.
Let's talk about that process, because I know we're talking about process right now, and let's really dive into that process when it comes to that kind of game day stuff and things that people can do themselves. So you know that long-term stuff would probably be best handled by a professional like yourself, and probably the short-term stuff as well. But for somebody who wants to kind of self-manage that kind of game day process, what are some things that they should be doing to optimize their weight management leading up to the meet, getting in that into that weight category, and then what should they be doing following? Because you talked about it, it's still quite a process between when they weigh in and when they finish the 9th or 10th deadlift. So what are some of the things that they should be doing? You've already talked about sodium, you've talked about water, you've talked about some carbohydrate stuff that they can do, and then you talked about following the weigh-in, replenishing some glycogen stores. So what is kind of the breakdown with that process?
I think the biggest thing you can do, let's say I talked about big picture stuff. If you can get yourself within 3% body weight of your weight class, you're in a good spot to make some short-term changes. Okay,
perfect. Because I was wondering what that percentage is. So some people are like, oh, well, you can cut 5%, the week of the meet, and you
can absolutely. It's a range. It's a sliding scale.
But you're saying the optimal that you're finding is if you can get within 3%, and that's going to be a different amount of kilos for everybody depending on what your weight class is. But if you can get within 3%, there's then some things that you can do.
For sure. I rarely talk about percentages, but in this context, when we're going across large weight classes, it's easier to apply because, yes, a larger male will be able to magnify that amount of weight. So we can talk percentages here. But generally, yes, you can make a weight cut from 7% body weight coming down, but it's not going to be fun. And I think generally setting something at 3% to 5% at the higher end of things gives you a good amount of time to make those short-term changes. And the biggest short-term change you can make probably revolves around sodium intake.
And this is something that I think a lot of people are focused on, I'm chugging the water, and then they forget what they're doing with sodium, or it doesn't even cross their mind. They don't know. So what should they be doing?
Within probably 24 to I'd almost say 36 hours, probably. Let's just say standard Saturday morning 7 a.m. weigh-in, starting to avoid sodium on Thursday night, and this could be as simple as stopping eating processed meats or processed food or anything super salty, like pizza and chicken fingers, for example, like stuff like very obvious, not going to eat those foods because I can tell how salty they are. As opposed to, there's always going to be a natural amount of sodium in some meats, even like chicken breast, that type of thing. Trying to avoid it on a minuscule scale is never going to happen, but avoiding it or shooting for something like 1,500 milligrams would be a low sodium diet for 24 hours is going to help you probably cut 1 to 2% body weight just by doing that, just by losing the water that you would hold with that sodium. And that's something where your body has a natural reserve of sodium already in your bones and different places, so it's not going to impact your health on a long term like it would avoiding water per se. So that's one thing. I think if you could take anything away from the short-term stuff, looking at sodium intake would probably be the biggest one.
And then following the weigh-in, because I know that a lot of people, and we've kind of touched on this in the podcast previously, but following the weigh-in, then what you've cut 3%.
Yep.
What is now the process of getting your energy back up and the fluids back in you? And I just, I want to tap into your knowledge here because we've had some people talk about this anecdotally on the podcast, but nothing in terms of like your own expertise and you're basically an expert in this area. So
even though you avoided sodium, what this avoiding sodium does, because it helps you retain water and water balance, is you excrete more fluid, right? So the first thing you'd really want to focus on is getting some fluids back in you somewhere along the lines, depending on how big you are, like at least 1 liter to 1,500 mils. You don't want to bombard yourself, your GI tract, right off the hop, but something around 1 liter to 1,500 liters of an electrolyte fluid, even just some sugar and salt would be more than fine, but some people will use things like Pedialyte, but it's an expensive type of.
How about chicken soup?
Chicken soup, I personally, after cutting weight, would not want to do chicken soup. I think I'd probably just drinking Gatorade is fine. But that's something that I would want to do immediately within like getting off the scale. Like I always find it funny where I see people like get out of the weigh-in room and like they're frantic and they start chugging the bottle and the next person can't get in. Like within 3 to 5 minutes, right? Is something that this happens. I saw it this year.
I'm gonna die.
Yeah, I'm gonna die. It's like 5 more minutes is not gonna kill you. If you push it this far, then first of all, you shouldn't be lifting weights. And
what do you like? I actually have seen people drinking soup broth after weigh-ins. Like that's a lot of sodium. Is that reasonable?
It's a process, right? Your gut can only handle so much at once. You are in a different position to probably take in sodium than a healthy, normal individual, right? Like a lot of the times when we do this type of research, we do it in populations where they haven't went through a process of depleting sodium. But at the same time, no, I think something somewhere along the lines of like just your like normal Gatorade solution or Pedialyte is going to be fine. I personally, I don't know if there's any extra benefit to drinking chicken broth, let alone I don't know. It's not like, take it easy on yourselves. People like the extremes, right? And if they can do something like that and talk about it, then maybe
so besides like Gatorade and fluids, like what do you think like a good post weigh-in meal would be to try and maximize?
I'd personally try to keep things as normal as possible as you can. I know people will try to eat like if you haven't ate pancakes and bacon for 4 months leading up to a contest, I don't think you should be eating it afterwards. But like normal breakfast food with some salt and some carbs, you really want to maximize carbohydrate at that point, because the things that you did in the long term to keep your body weight in a good place, like let's say you're in a caloric deficit and your protein was increased, because that's something you should do to minimize lean tissue losses. You don't need to do in that short-term phase as much. So eating carbohydrates, so like something like pancakes would be good, or if you've been eating rice for a large portion of your meals leading up to it, something like just eating rice. I know it's kind of a little bit tough in the morning, but something like that along those lines would be good. Some
what
fruit.
do you think about fat? Like I know people say try to avoid fat during meat day. What do you?
If it doesn't upset your stomach, you're going to get a large amount of calories by consuming fat, but at the same time, it can kind of delay gastric emptying, and that's something that you don't want to do in that period. So if we're talking 10 grams of fat in, like the sausages you happen to eat while you're eating your pancakes, that's not a huge deal. But I wouldn't actively try to like eat peanut butter or something right after that meal, because it's going to delay the process.
Right.
And you want the process to be happening quickly. So I would focus on fluids within that first 10 minutes, and then probably a smaller snack within 15 minutes, and a meal hopefully within 20 to 30 minutes as the process gets going.
And when you say eating fats will delay the process, you just mean that it'll be like it's hard for. What does that actually mean?
So eating dietary fat, and this is why it's included in a lot of diets, although it's not necessarily a performance nutrient, it delays gastric emptying, and it helps you stay full. So the process of you rehydrating is going to be slowed down by eating a large amount of fats. So the process doesn't start as quickly if you are consuming dietary fat.
Now we're talking about macronutrients. We're talking about fats, protein, carbs. Those are the three macronutrients, and we've talked a lot about the short-term stuff that you prescribe for athletes in terms of like meet day stuff. But now kind of zooming out and looking at big picture.
Yeah.
How important is it, do you feel, for the average athlete, and you can even lump any of us into this category, just the regular power lifter, how important do you feel it is for people like us to be tracking, I guess, your macros, or understanding how many macros you're consuming on a daily or weekly basis? Like, I'll just use myself as an example. Like, I don't do that. Like, I mean, I know essentially what my plate, every time I go and have a meal, like
Sure.
what my plate should look like. Like, I need some protein and some carbs and some vegetables, and there's some fats thrown in there throughout the day, but I'm not out there kind of actively trying to get 300 grams of protein, or actively trying to get whatever the macronutrients are.
Sure.
Like, I'm not out there tracking and analyzing it to such a granular level. But do you find that there's quite a performance benefit in doing that? There's some athletes on the podcast who have said that they do it and they find it they find a need. There's a need for it, and they find their performance is going up as a result. Would you recommend doing something like that?
Okay, I have a million things running through my head, but I'm going to try to address it.
That's a long question.
It is, it's a really good question, though. It does sound like you are an adequate intuitive eater, which means you can eat until you're full. You know generally that being a strength athlete, you should increase your protein intake, and you do a good job of doing that because you've gotten stronger over time. You've gained muscle over time. You're really good at intuitive eating. You eat when you're hungry, you eat until you're full, you eat 3 square meals a day. You do some things that allow you to perform well in the gym, and that'll be a pre-workout meal like 1 to 3 hours beforehand that has some protein and some carbohydrates, and you do a good job of that. A large majority of people cannot do that. Tracking your intake entirely is that one of the biggest questions I get as a nutritionist is what should I eat before my workout, what should I eat after my workout. By focusing on those two things, you miss the bigger picture, which is your daily intake over obviously days, but also weeks, and those are going to be the things that influence your body composition more than what you eat before the meal, before working out, or after working out. But people will focus in on that small thing, and it might be, the media saying you need to eat a certain thing before you work out. This is going to increase your performance, but increasing your muscle mass or improving your body composition is something that happens over days and weeks and months. So focusing on the bigger picture, which is focusing on macronutrient intake, which is going to be a function of your overall energy intake, will allow you to make those big picture changes. So I think in terms of tracking, it's very beneficial to getting some sort of baseline of what you need, and at the same points, we know things like tracking your metrics in terms of total volume and tonnages is going to allow you to make progress. If you want to take things to the next level, it's definitely something that we have the tools to make it easy enough to do. I don't see why someone wouldn't do it.
Like, in my mind, I'm trying to see these parallels between, okay, you're saying like you should be tracking your macronutrients, and that there's a large majority of people that would benefit from that. And just coming from my work with tracking metrics and what I'm trying to do with my strength book and the application, is we're not looking at each individual workout and, okay, you have a bad workout or you have a bad meal, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if you look at kind of your metrics and what you're doing over the course of a week and over the course of months, you can then start to get a handle of those big picture things that are going to have a large impact on your performance, whether that's your workouts or whether that's your nutrition. Do you find so I tried to recently, through a little bit of peer pressure, I was trying to do a day of tracking my macros. Like I was like, okay, I want to actually figure out like how much I'm going to eat this day. And there's lots of applications out there, and I'm sure that you get your own clients, using apps to track, what they're intaking. But then what do I do with that information? Like, okay, I found it not to be that hard of a process to track. I think like once you get into a rhythm and you just, you kind of get, you get the handle of, okay, like, just inputting your sort of your meals. Once you get in the habit of that, like what am I then looking to do over time with that data? Like what am I looking for? Like what am I doing with it?
Okay, well, you shouldn't be just tracking for the sake of tracking. Like you don't track your budget just to know how much money you're spending. You're trying to do that within the context of some sort of goal, which is like saving money, that type of thing. So you're not just tracking for the sake of tracking. What you're doing is tracking usually towards some sort of target for each of the macronutrients or a calorie goal. Like you wouldn't just say, it's important for you to say, here's where I'm at and here's what I normally eat and that's what it looks like in terms of a macronutrient basis. But what you would do at that point is make an assessment. Is my protein intake within a level that allows me to perform as a strength athlete? And that's generally somewhere along the lines of most strength athletes should be consuming 1.5 to probably on the upper end of things, 3.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So if you're not within that level, once you've realized this is what I eat on a normal basis, you should be tracking towards a target that allows you to perform well, allows you to gain muscle over time. And that's the same thing with the protein would be the most important. The other two aren't as important in terms of body composition changes, but you need to be able to focus on them to create a caloric deficit or a surplus depending on your goals. So I guess the other thing would be, I think I find a lot of the times when people don't track, they get in this mindset of healthy versus unhealthy foods, and they think they have this idea of what they should be consuming, and they generally, what I've seen time and time again, is go through these phases where they're almost restrictive throughout the week till they get to a point where it's just this binge cycle on the weekend, and then the process repeats themselves. I think my research around you, Abby, is that you claim to want abs probably upwards of 8 times per week. I've read in various social media places, but you also, the context of what you need to do to get abs is creating some sort of caloric deficit to reveal them, but you also don't want to do the work to do that, right? So it's just...
This is all very true.
Yeah, so you actually didn't know this was an intervention.
Yeah, you want abs, but you don't want them as much as you want pasta, right?
Right, exactly. So
you gotta make some tough choices in life, guys.
You do, and that's important. But at the same time, I do find that when people aren't tracking, they think they have this idea of what's healthy, and generally it is. It consists of eating lean protein and vegetables, but it gets to a point where if they're depriving themselves of a carbohydrate intake that would allow them to perform, they over time are going to just deplete to the point where they can't handle it anymore, be it they're too restrictive with their food choices, and then on the weekends it's just this binge cycle that puts them back, all the progress that they made. So tracking allows you to be a lot more normalized, right? It allows you to find some middle ground and make progress over weeks of time as opposed to just thinking you're doing something right and then having it all blow up in your face. And it allows you to give a baseline level of what you should be doing. So what you're saying is you track and you try to have an idea of what I would do is, like, if you have a normal intake, you track that for five days, try to get some idea of the averages and based on how you're performing, and then see how those fit within some of the recommendations we have for strength athletes, and then set some targets and track towards those, not tracking for the sake of tracking, because that's not beneficial.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. So
going along the lines of like the tracking and stuff, how important do you think it is like timing wise. So
Yeah.
pre-workout versus post-workout timings. I know like some people, they don't like to eat a lot prior to training, right? Just because they can't, I don't know, they put a belt on, they're like, oh, I feel like I'm going to throw up or whatever.
Sure.
But I mean, then again, it's super important to have something in your stomach, right?
Yeah.
Right, for the energy purposes. And like, say if you have a longer duration workout, you have to eat some more, or
extending that from Steve, like when I think about tracking macros and just from talking to people who do that, they kind of have a mentality that's like, it doesn't matter when I get the macros in, it's more like as long as I get them in within the day, then I'm fine. So is there any sort of consideration, exactly what Steve is saying, around meal timing and spacing the meals out throughout the day, or would it be okay to get all my macros in within 1 or 2 meals versus 4 or 5 or 6?
So the meal frequency thing has been debated for years. What kind of impact does it have on your metabolism and body weight and body composition? What I will say is if you're focusing, I guess it kind of goes back to my last point that I made. If you miss the boat on the big picture concepts, the totals over the course of the day, this peri-workout, intra-workout nutrition, what you eat beforehand, isn't going to be as beneficial because, like going back to the budget analogy, if you focus on saving money within 3 hours, but at the course of the day you're running this huge deficit, it doesn't matter what you're doing within that 2 to 3 hours in terms of long-term glycogen resynthesis, because first of all, digestion is a long process, especially when you're eating not liquids but whole foods. This is something that takes 8 to 12 hours from start to finish. It's not like you just eat and then everything completely goes through your GI tract. The absorption process, digestion, absorption, where it goes, takes a long time. I mean, it takes upwards of, so like if you were like upwards of 8 to 12 hours, transit time totally can take 24 hours. So you focusing on what you need to eat before your workout, if you've already ate 6 hours before you exercise, there's a good chance that you're still digesting things and still getting things released into your bloodstream, right? So there's significant overlap in that respect. Like let's say you work out in the morning first thing and you can't tolerate eating something beforehand. That's not necessarily the end of the world, and although some people would tell you it is, that you need to eat breakfast beforehand, but if you can't tolerate it, you shouldn't. But maybe before bed you focus on eating a slower digesting protein or something that's going to take longer to digest. So that's where a slower digesting protein like cottage cheese is a good example, and some source of dietary fat that will help, again, the opposite of that small window, increase the amount of time it takes you to actually digest. It delays that gastric emptying. That'll be something that you focus on, right?
For example, so someone can't
That's good advice.
Someone can't, like, I don't know, have something solid before, like, say, for example, for me, like, I go in, I like to eat in the morning, so I could have something, go train, but someone that can't, what can they eat that's more, like, fast digesting? So something quick, get into your stream a little bit faster, like something quick, like some sugars or, like, fruits, something.
Yeah, no, like fruit would be a really good example. Something light, like something like berries and like Greek yogurt would cover your basis in terms of having some carbohydrate and a good source of protein. Yeah. Something like that. I do find that that type of topic is very individual. Some people will say, I need to have like a heavy meal 2 hours beforehand to feel something in my stomach, where others are like, I can't eat 3 hours beforehand. I've had an elite level athlete, powerlifter, work with me. She literally, for I don't know what it is with nerves or anything, can't eat 12 hours before, not because she's cutting weight, because she literally just can't stomach it, and she performs just fine all the time.
I think this is a really, really important point that you're making, which is, you can have all of these recommendations out there, which are important, but you also have to take a look at the individual and saying and playing a little bit to their preferences and and their individual context, and making sure that whatever nutritional sort of recommendations that you're making are structured around that individual. And we do the same thing when it comes to powerlifting programming. I think at this time, Mark, you've said a lot of great information, and I want to end the podcast here with you talking a little bit about your ebook that you're about to publish. It sounds like it's fantastic. Can you talk about your ebook?
Yeah, what I'm going to try to do. The goal, the scope of the book is putting together a comprehensive resource in terms of how someone should cut weight within like the percentages that are normal and healthy, long-term planning, kind of telling you what you're supposed to do. But I really want to make it comprehensive in terms of, I kind of like in the last 5 years, you read things like from Lyle McDonald, for example, and they're like the most comprehensive resources you can get. So I'm inspired by that. And I want to put together, there's not a lot of good weight cutting books. So what I'm going to do is put together something where we focus on the long term, how do you do those things, and what you focus on the short term. And if you should cut weight, are you in a good position to cut weight? Is it something that you should be doing? Because all those things play into the process, let alone things like athlete mindsets through the process. Those things really all come into play. Because I know, for example, the people that we're talking about, yeah, like I make a 7% body weight cut, an elite level athlete. That does not mean that the regular third time lifting at a meet athlete should be doing that. And that's not to say that it's because they won't perform well or anything, but we're talking about someone that has everything dialed in and can do it, right? They have the mindset to do it. I've worked with elite athletes that they know through the process that this is something that's really going to suck, but they're still committed to it, and they see the end goal, and it's important that they do that, as opposed to someone that's doing it for whatever reason. You know what I mean? They know in their head they're not tricking themselves into thinking, oh, this is going to be fun, but they're committed to the process. And based on everyone that I've worked with, at the same time, the things that I've read from other athletes that do these things, that sort of thing goes into that. So that's what I'm going to explore is the practical implications of this stuff, the kind of overview background on why we're manipulating things, and then some more different aspects of cutting weight, like the athlete mindset. So that's kind of what I'm all trying to focus on with the ebook.
It sounds like this is going to be a great resource. It sounds like it's going to be a great resource for powerlifters, and you're doing us a huge favor for our listeners. You're actually going to give away one free copy of the ebook. It's not published right now. It's unpublished, and so they'll get their hands on it first before everybody else. Absolutely. And we're going to actually do the draw at the end of June. I believe we're going to do it on June 30th. So you have the entire month here to go to our website, www.canadianpowerliftingpodcast.com, and click on the contest section and get your information in. It sounds like a fantastic resource. And just before you go, Mark, how can people get in contact with you?
Yes, my Facebook page would be Marc W. Morris. My Instagram is the same thing, MARC W. Morris. My email would be marc@polyhealth, which is the name of my business, polyhealth.ca.
And how do you spell polyhealth? How do you spell polyhealth?
POLYHEALTH.
Spelling
it'd be terrible. It'd be terrible if I couldn't spell that.
And you got a website. You got a website as well for polyhealth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is polyhealth.ca as well. If you were looking to follow up and work with me, I'm going to just bring it up here for a second. Under my services tab at the top, there's an assessment. If you were looking at getting a dietary assessment done, you can go to that, fill that out, and I would follow up with you in terms of the process and how I work with clients.
I can't recommend Mark enough. He's worked with a lot of my athletes and friends as well, and does great work. So thanks for coming on the podcast, Mark. And you're actually coming down to you're the head coach for the Master Men's in Texas. So we'll all see you down in Texas. And thanks, buddy.
You bet. Looking forward to it.
All right. So thank Dr. Marc Morris for coming on the podcast with some great conversations, and hopefully sometimes we can get him back on and hit more of those topics more in depth. Before we wrap up here, we're not going to be on our regular schedule to release our next podcast. The three of us are going to be in Killeen, Texas for the World Championship, so we'll be releasing the next episode, I think, the first week of July or so. Stay tuned for that, but we will try to get some content while we're there and have some guests on the podcast. So that's all for this week. Good luck to everyone at World.
Make sure you hashtag Canadian Powerlifting Podcast. We out.
Bye.
This episode was brought to you by LVD Fitness, where LVD stands for Lift, Visualize, and Dominate. Visit lvdfitness.com to pick up your CPU approved swag and follow them at LVD Fitness to find out which events they're coming to near you and to catch a sneak peek of their spring collection. You've been listening to the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast, the podcast that brings you the best of powerlifting in Canada, hosted by Stephen Cassioli, Ryan Stinn, and myself, Abby Silverberg. Please follow us on Instagram and check out our website for some great free powerlifting content at www.canadianpowerliftingpodcast.com. If you like what you heard today, please rate our podcast on iTunes and don't forget to listen to every other Thursday for a brand new episode.